The morning sun painted golden streaks across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as 10-year-old Prince George walked alongside his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. The young prince's school uniform was perfectly pressed, his hair neatly combed, but his eyes sparkled with the curiosity that only a child could possess. Today was different from his usual visits to the castle. Today, he would witness something that would change his understanding of respect, tradition, and human dignity forever. The Queen had decided to take George on a special tour of the castle grounds, something she rarely did with visiting dignitaries, let alone her great-grandson. She wanted him to understand the weight of history that surrounded their family, the responsibility that came with their position, and most importantly, the respect they owed to those who served them. As they walked through the ornate corridors lined with portraits of kings and queens from centuries past, George listened intently to his grandmother's stories. She spoke of battles fought, decisions made, and the countless individuals who had dedicated their lives to protecting the crown. Her voice carried a warmth that was reserved only for family, yet it held the wisdom of decades of leadership. "George," the Queen said, pausing near a large window that overlooked the courtyard. "Do you see that man standing by the gate?" George pressed his small face against the cool glass and spotted a tall figure in a red uniform standing perfectly still. The guard's posture was rigid, his expression stoic, and his eyes focused straight ahead. Even from a distance, George could see the dedication etched in the man's stance. "He's been standing there since 6 this morning," the Queen continued, "and he'll remain there until his shift ends at 2 this afternoon. 8 hours without moving, without speaking, without acknowledging the tourists who try to make him laugh or the children who wave at him." George's eyes widened. He had seen the guards before, of course, but he had never really thought about what their job entailed. "Doesn't he get tired, Granny?" "I'm certain he does," the Queen replied with a gentle smile. "But he has taken an oath to protect this castle, to protect our family, and to uphold traditions that have existed for hundreds of years. His name is William Matthews, and he has served the Crown Guard for 15 years. The mention of the guard's name surprised George. He had assumed the guards were just figures in uniform, not real people with names and families and lives outside these walls. "How do you know his name?" "Because, my dear George, it is my responsibility to know the people who serve us. Each guard, each member of the household staff, each person who works within these walls, has a story, a family, and dreams of their own. They are not just servants or protectors, they are human beings who deserve our respect and recognition." As they continued their walk, George found himself thinking about William Matthews. What did he think about during those long hours of standing still? Did he have children? Did he ever get hungry or thirsty? These questions swirled in the young prince's mind as they made their way to the castle's main entrance. The tour had been planned to conclude at the front gates, where a small ceremony was scheduled to take place. A visiting delegation from Scotland was expected to arrive, and the Queen wanted George to observe the formal proceedings. As they approached the entrance, George noticed more guards positioned at various points, each maintaining the same perfect posture and unwavering focus. "The Scottish delegation should arrive any moment," the Queen explained, checking her watch. "This will be a good opportunity for you to see how we receive official visitors." George nodded, but his attention kept drifting to the guards. He watched as tourists walked by, some taking selfies near the guards, others trying to make them smile or react. The guards remained completely still, their professionalism unwavering despite the constant distractions. One particular guard caught George's attention. He was younger than the others, perhaps in his early 20s, with kind eyes that seemed to hold stories despite his stern expression. This guard was positioned closest to where George and the Queen were standing, and something about his demeanor struck the young prince as particularly noble. "Granny," George whispered, "that guard over there. What's his name?" The Queen followed George's gaze and smiled softly. "That is James Richardson. He's new to the castle guard, only been here for 6 months. He comes from a small village in Yorkshire, and this position means everything to him and his family." George studied James's face more carefully. Despite the rigid formality of his position, there was something warm about him. The young prince found himself wondering what James was like when he wasn't on duty, whether he laughed easily, what his favorite food was, whether he had pets. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted George's thoughts. The Scottish delegation's motorcade was arriving, a line of black cars with small flags fluttering in the morning breeze. Protocol dictated that everyone present should maintain proper decorum during the formal reception. As the cars came to a stop, George positioned himself beside his grandmother, trying to stand as straight and formal as the guards around them. He had been taught the importance of these ceremonial occasions, how every gesture and movement was observed and recorded, how the dignity of the monarchy was maintained through such traditions. The delegation members emerged from their vehicles, dressed in formal Scottish attire, complete with clan tartans and ceremonial swords. They formed a neat line and began their approach toward the castle entrance, where the Queen and Prince George stood waiting to receive them. It was then that something unexpected happened. As the delegation walked past the guards, one of the Scottish visitors, an elderly man with a walking stick, stumbled slightly on the uneven cobblestones. He didn't fall, but the stumble was noticeable enough that he paused to regain his balance. George watched as James Richardson's eyes flickered slightly toward the elderly man. It was the tiniest movement, barely perceptible, but George noticed it. The guard's training told him to remain still and focused ahead, but his human instinct was clearly concerned for the visitor's welfare. The elderly Scottish delegate recovered quickly and continued walking, but George had seen something in James's expression that moved him. Despite his duty to remain motionless, despite the strict protocols he was bound to follow, the young guard had shown genuine concern for another person's well-being. "Did you see that, Granny?" George whispered as the delegation approached them. "See what, dear?" the Queen asked, preparing to greet their visitors. "The guard, James. He wanted to help that man who stumbled." The Queen glanced at George with interest, but didn't respond immediately, as the Scottish delegation had reached them, and formal greetings were about to begin. However, George could tell from her expression that she had understood the significance of what he had observed. As the ceremony proceeded, George found it difficult to concentrate on the formal speeches and presentations. His mind kept returning to that moment when he had seen James's human compassion shine through his professional duties. It made him realize something profound about the people who served his family. These weren't just guards or servants. They were individuals with hearts and minds and feelings. They had chosen to dedicate their lives to protecting and serving the royal family, often at great personal sacrifice. They stood for hours in all weather, maintained perfect discipline under difficult circumstances, and did so with pride and honor. The ceremony concluded with the traditional exchange of gifts and the singing of both national anthems. As the Scottish delegation was escorted into the castle for a formal luncheon, George found himself with a few moments alone with his grandmother in the courtyard. "Granny," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about knowing the names of the people who serve us. And what have you been thinking about it? I think it's more than just knowing their names. It's about seeing them as real people, not just uniforms or job titles." The Queen's eyes twinkled with pride. "That's a very mature observation, George. What made you think of that?" George told her about watching James's reaction to the stumbling delegate, how he had seen the guard's concern despite his duty to remain motionless. "It made me realize that he's not just a guard, he's a person who cares about others, even when he's not supposed to show it. And how do you think that makes him feel, having to suppress his natural instincts to help others?" George considered this question carefully. He imagined what it would be like to see someone in need and not be able to help because of the rules of his job. It would be frustrating, maybe even painful. "I think it must be hard for him," he said finally. "I think you're right," the Queen agreed. "And I think that understanding makes you see why these men and women deserve our deepest respect. They sacrifice not just their time and comfort, but sometimes even their natural human responses in service to the crown." As they walked back toward the castle entrance, George noticed that James was still at his post, still standing perfectly still, still maintaining his vigilant watch. But now, when George looked at him, he saw something different. He saw a young man from Yorkshire who had chosen a life of service, who stood there with pride despite the personal challenges it might present. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the courtyard, and George knew his visit would soon be coming to an end. But something had changed in him during this tour. His understanding of what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to show respect had deepened considerably. "Granny," he said as they paused at the castle entrance, "I want to do something. I want to do something." "What did you have in mind?" George looked back at James, still standing at attention, still maintaining his perfect posture despite hours of duty. An idea was forming in the young prince's mind, something that felt both right and important. But he wasn't sure if it would be appropriate or if it might break some important protocol. "I want to show him that we see him, that we appreciate what he's doing. But I don't know how to do that without getting him in trouble or breaking the rules." The Queen considered her great-grandson's words carefully. She could see the genuine concern and respect in his young eyes, and she recognized that this was a teachable moment that could shape his character for years to come. "Sometimes, George," she said slowly, "the most powerful gestures are the simplest ones. And sometimes, the rules can be bent slightly when the intention is pure, and the gesture comes from genuine respect." George looked up at his grandmother with hope in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean that there are ways to show respect and appreciation that don't require words or grand gestures. Sometimes a simple acknowledgement, done with the right spirit and at the right moment, can mean more than any formal ceremony." As the Queen spoke, George's mind was already working through possibilities. He wanted to do something that would let James know that his service was seen and valued, something that wouldn't compromise the guard's position but would acknowledge his humanity and dedication. The sound of changing guard formations in the distance reminded them both that the afternoon shift would soon be taking over. James's 8-hour duty was nearly complete, and soon he would be replaced by another guard who would stand in that same spot until evening. "His shift is almost over," George observed. "Yes, it is. In about 15 minutes, the changing of the guard will take place, and James will be relieved of his duties for the day." George watched as other guards began moving into position for the formal changing ceremony. It was a tradition he had witnessed many times before, but today it held new meaning for him. Today he understood that this wasn't just a ceremony for tourists. It was a moment when one person's dedicated service gave way to another's, an unbroken chain of protection and commitment that had continued for centuries. "Granny, may I stay to watch the changing of the guard?" "Of course, dear. I think that would be very appropriate." As they waited for the ceremony to begin, George found himself studying not just James, but all the guards positioned around the courtyard. Each one had a story, a family, a life beyond these walls. Each one had made sacrifices to serve the crown, and each one deserved recognition for their dedication. But there was something special about James. Something about that moment when George had seen his humanity shine through his professional duties that made the young prince want to acknowledge him specifically. The question was, how to do it in a way that would be meaningful without being inappropriate. The changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin, and George could feel the anticipation in the air. Palace staff had gathered at respectful distances, tourists pressed against the outer gates trying to get the best view, and the guards themselves prepared for the formal handover of duties. James Richardson maintained his perfect stance, but George thought he could detect the slightest hint of relief in his posture. 8 hours of standing at attention was no small feat, and the young prince found himself marveling at the physical and mental discipline required for such a task. "The ceremony will begin shortly," the Queen explained to George. "Watch carefully as the new guards approach. Notice how precise every movement is, how each step has been practiced thousands of times. This is tradition in its purest form." George nodded, but his attention remained focused on James. He had made a decision about what he wanted to do, but he wasn't sure if he would have the courage to follow through with it when the moment came. The sound of marching feet echoed across the courtyard as the relief guards approached in perfect formation. Their red uniforms were immaculate, their movements synchronized, and their bearing proud and professional. Leading them was a sergeant whose years of experience showed in every confident step. As the new guards took their positions, the formal handover process began. Each outgoing guard would be replaced by his counterpart in a series of carefully choreographed movements that had been performed the same way for generations. George watched as James prepared for his relief. The young guard's replacement approached. A slightly older man with the same stoic expression and perfect posture. In a few moments, James would be free to leave his post, to return to his quarters, to finally relax after his long duty. Now watch this part carefully, the Queen whispered to George. This is when the responsibility passes from one guard to another. It's a sacred trust. The formal exchange took place with military precision. James and his replacement went through the ritual steps. The acknowledgement, the verbal confirmation, the physical transfer of the post. Throughout it all, both men maintained their professional demeanor, but George could see the subtle signs of relief in James's eyes. As James stepped away from his post, now officially off duty, George felt his heart rate increase. This was his moment, his chance to show the young guard that his service had been noticed and appreciated. But doubt crept into his mind. What if he was breaking some important rule? What if his gesture caused problems for James? The Queen seemed to sense his internal struggle. "George," she said quietly, "sometimes the most important thing we can do is follow our hearts while respecting the dignity of others. Trust your instincts." That was all the encouragement George needed. As James began walking away from his post, heading toward the guardhouse to complete his shift, George made his move. "Excuse me, sir," George called out, his young voice clear and polite. James stopped immediately and turned toward the sound. When he saw Prince George approaching, his training kicked in and he snapped to attention, ready to salute or respond to whatever the young royal might need. But what happened next surprised everyone who witnessed it. Instead of expecting James to maintain his formal military bearing, Prince George did something unexpected. He stopped a few feet in front of the guard, and, with the sincerity that only a child could possess, he bowed his head slightly in a gesture of respect. "Thank you for protecting us today," George said simply. "I saw how dedicated you were, standing there for so many hours. I wanted you to know that your service is appreciated." The effect of this simple gesture was immediate and profound. James, who had been prepared to respond with military formality, found himself completely taken aback by the young prince's humility and genuine gratitude. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the courtyard fell completely silent. Palace staff stopped what they were doing. Tourists pressed closer to the gates, trying to understand what was happening. And even the other guards turned to witness this unprecedented interaction. James stood frozen, uncertain how to respond. In all his months of service, he had never experienced anything like this. Royal protocol didn't cover situations where a member of the royal family showed such personal gratitude to a guard. His training told him to maintain his formal bearing. But his human heart was deeply moved by the young prince's sincerity. The Queen watched the scene unfold with a mixture of pride and curiosity. She had hoped that George would find a meaningful way to acknowledge James's service, but she hadn't expected her great-grandson to display such natural instinct for leadership and respect. "Your Royal Highness," James began, his voice slightly uncertain. "It is my honor to serve." No thanks are necessary, but George wasn't finished. With the same natural grace that seemed to run in the royal bloodline, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small. It was a simple white envelope, nothing fancy or elaborate, but something he had prepared during the ceremony. "I wrote something for you," George said, offering the envelope to James. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have it." James looked at the envelope, then at Prince George, then toward the Queen. Uncertain whether accepting such a gift would be appropriate, the Queen gave him the slightest nod of encouragement, and James carefully took the envelope from the young prince's hands. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," James said, his formal training helping him navigate this uncharted territory. "I am honored." George smiled, the kind of genuine, happy smile that children give when they've done something they know is right. "You don't have to call me that when it's just us talking. My name is George." This simple statement had an even more profound impact than the bow or the letter. For James, who had spent months thinking of the royal family as distant figures to be protected and served, Hearing Prince George speak to him as one human being to another was both surprising and deeply moving. "Thank you, George," James said. And even though the words felt strange coming from his mouth, they also felt right. The Queen stepped forward then, her presence adding official weight to the interaction. "Mr. Richardson," she said, "I hope you know how much your service means to our family. My great-grandson has shown excellent judgment in recognizing your dedication." James snapped to attention immediately upon being addressed by the Queen. "Your Majesty, it is my privilege to serve." "Indeed it is," the Queen replied warmly. "And it is our privilege to be served by individuals of your caliber and character." The formal acknowledgement from the Queen elevated the moment beyond a simple exchange between a boy and a guard. It became an official recognition of James's service, something that would be remembered and recorded in the annals of palace history. As the crowd of onlookers began to disperse and normal activities resumed around the courtyard, George found himself walking back toward the castle entrance with his grandmother, but he couldn't resist looking back at James, who was still standing where they had left him, holding the white envelope and wearing an expression of wonder and pride. "What did you write in the letter?" the Queen asked as they walked. George's cheeks colored slightly with embarrassment. "Just a thank you note. I told him that I saw how hard he worked today, and that I thought he was very brave to stand there for so many hours protecting us. I also told him that I hoped his family knows how proud they should be of him." The Queen's eyes misted slightly with pride. "That was beautifully done, George. You showed real leadership today, real understanding of what service means and how it should be honored. Do you think I did the right thing? I was worried I might have broken some rule or gotten him in trouble." "You did exactly the right thing," the Queen assured him. "You showed respect without diminishing his dignity. You acknowledged his service without making it seem like an obligation. And you treated him as a fellow human being while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Those are the qualities of a true leader." As they entered the castle, George felt a sense of satisfaction that went deeper than simple pride. He had learned something important today about respect, about service, and about the power of simple human acknowledgement. But more than that, he had discovered something about himself, about his own capacity for leadership and empathy. Meanwhile, back in the courtyard, James Richardson carefully opened the white envelope that Prince George had given him. Inside was a piece of palace stationery, with a handwritten note in the careful script of a 10-year-old boy. "Dear Mr. Richardson," the note read, "Thank you for protecting my family today. I watched you standing at your post for many hours, and I thought you were very brave and professional. My grandmother told me that you come from Yorkshire, and that this job means a lot to you and your family. I want you to know that your service means a lot to us too. I hope your family knows how proud they should be of you. Thank you for your dedication and service. Respectfully yours, George." James read the note twice, then carefully folded it and placed it back in the envelope. In all his dreams of what military service might bring, he had never imagined receiving such personal recognition from a member of the royal family. The sincerity of the young prince's words, combined with the respect he had shown, made James feel that every hour of training, every moment of discomfort, every sacrifice he had made to be here had been worthwhile. Word of the interaction spread quickly through the palace staff. By evening, everyone from the head butler to the kitchen staff had heard about Prince George's gesture of respect toward the young guard. The story was told with admiration and pride, as staff members recognized that this incident revealed something important about the character of the future king. In the guardhouse that evening, James shared the story with his fellow guards. He showed them the letter, though he kept the details private, and told them about Prince George's unexpected humility and genuine gratitude. The other guards listened with interest and respect, understanding that what had happened was both unprecedented and deeply meaningful. "The boy gets it," said Sergeant Williams, a 20-year veteran of the Guard. "He understands that we're not just decorations or tourist attractions. We're people who have chosen to serve, and that choice deserves recognition." James nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by the day's events. When he bowed his head to me, I didn't know what to do. I've never had anyone show me that kind of respect for just doing my job. "That's because it wasn't just about doing your job," another guard observed. "It was about how you did it. The prince saw something in your bearing, your dedication, that impressed him. That's not something that happens every day. As the evening wore on and the guards prepared for their next shifts, the story of Prince George's gesture continued to resonate through the castle. It became a reminder to everyone who worked there that their service was seen, valued, and appreciated by the family they protected. But perhaps most importantly, it marked a moment of growth for Prince George himself. In choosing to acknowledge James Richardson's service, in taking the time to write a personal note, in showing genuine respect for someone whose job it was to serve his family, the young prince had demonstrated the kind of leadership qualities that would serve him well in the years to come. The Queen, reflecting on the day's events as she prepared for bed, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had hoped that the castle tour would teach George about the importance of service and respect. But he had exceeded her expectations. He had not only learned these lessons but had acted on them in a way that showed true character and wisdom. As she looked out her bedroom window at the guards taking their positions for the night shift, the Queen felt confident that the monarchy would be in good hands when it was George's turn to lead. Today had shown her that he possessed not just the formal knowledge of royal protocol, but the human understanding and empathy that would make him a truly great king. 3 months had passed since Prince George's memorable encounter with guard James Richardson, and the ripple effects of that simple gesture continued to spread throughout Windsor Castle and beyond. The story had become something of a legend among the palace staff, shared in quiet moments, and remembered as an example of true leadership and human decency. For James Richardson, the experience had been transformative. The letter from Prince George sat framed on his small desk in the guardhouse dormitory, and he read it every morning before beginning his shift. It served as a reminder not just of the honor he had received, but of the responsibility he carried as a representative of something larger than himself. His performance had improved noticeably since that day. Other guards commented on his increased confidence, his even steadier bearing, and the pride that seemed to radiate from him during his duties. The recognition from Prince George had given him a deeper understanding of the meaning behind his service, and it showed in everything he did. Word of the incident had eventually reached James's family in Yorkshire. When he had written to tell his parents about meeting Prince George, his mother had cried with joy, and his father, a man of few words, had simply said, "I always knew you were meant for something special, son." The village where James had grown up buzzed with excitement when the story spread through local channels. The local pub now displayed a newspaper clipping about palace guards, alongside James's academy graduation photo. For a small Yorkshire community that had seen little recognition over the years, having one of their own, personally thanked by a future king, was a source of immense pride. Meanwhile, Prince George had continued his education with renewed enthusiasm for learning about leadership and service. His tutors noticed a change in his approach to his studies, particularly when they covered topics related to monarchy, government, and public service. The experience with James had given him real-world context for the abstract concepts he was learning in his lessons. He had also begun asking more questions about the people who worked at the various royal residences. During visits to Buckingham Palace, Balmoral, and Sandringham, George would inquire about the staff members he met, wanting to know their names, their backgrounds, and how long they had been in service to the crown. The Queen had noticed this change in her great-grandson and was deeply pleased by it. During their regular tea meetings, she would share stories about memorable staff members she had known throughout her reign, helping George understand the rich tapestry of individuals who had dedicated their lives to serving the monarchy. Leadership, the Queen often reminded George, is not about commanding others to serve you. It's about understanding the value of their service and ensuring they know they are appreciated for it. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 3 months after his first encounter with James, Prince George was scheduled for another visit to Windsor Castle. This time, the visit had a more formal purpose. He was to observe a ceremony honoring long-serving palace staff members, an annual tradition that recognized dedication and loyalty. As George arrived at the castle with his security detail, he immediately looked toward the gate where he had first seen James standing at attention. To his delight, James was there again, having been specifically requested for duty during the ceremony by his commanding officer, who thought it would be fitting given his previous interaction with the prince. The ceremony was set to take place in the castle's main courtyard, with representatives from all the royal households in attendance. Palace staff members who had served for 10, 15, and 20 years would receive formal recognition from the Queen herself, with Prince George present as an observer and participant in the proceedings. As the ceremony began, George took his place beside his grandmother, wearing his best formal attire and carrying himself with the dignified bearing expected of a future king. But his eyes kept drifting to James, who stood at his post with the same perfect posture and professional demeanor that had impressed George months earlier. The Queen called forward staff members one by one, each receiving a certificate and a few personal words of thanks. George watched as housekeepers, groundskeepers, cooks, and administrative staff stepped forward to be recognized. Each person's face lit up with pride as they were acknowledged for their years of dedicated service. When the ceremony concluded, the Queen turned to George with a meaningful look. "I believe there is one more presentation to be made today," she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades of royal protocol. George felt his heart rate increase as he realized what his grandmother was suggesting. They had discussed this possibility during their planning meetings, but he hadn't been certain it would actually happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Queen announced to the assembled crowd, "before we conclude today's ceremony, Prince George would like to make a special presentation." George stepped forward, his young voice clear and confident as he spoke to the gathered staff members. 3 months ago, I learned something important about service and respect during my visit here. Today, I would like to formally recognize someone whose dedication exemplifies the very best of what it means to serve the crown. He paused, looking directly at James, who stood at attention but with clear surprise in his eyes. "Guard, James Richardson, would you please step forward?" The courtyard fell silent as James, guided by his training but clearly moved by the unexpected recognition, left his post and approached the area where the ceremony was taking place. As he walked across the cobblestones, other staff members applauded softly, understanding that they were witnessing something special. When James reached the ceremonial area, he stood at attention before Prince George and the Queen. His fellow guards watched with pride and amazement, recognizing that this honor reflected well on all of them. "Mr. Richardson," George began, his voice steady despite his youth. 3 months ago, you taught me something about the true meaning of service. Through your dedication, your professionalism, and your unwavering commitment to duty, you showed me what it means to serve something larger than yourself." George paused, looking at James with genuine respect and gratitude. "Your service has not gone unnoticed, and your example has inspired me to be a better future leader. On behalf of my family and the crown, I want to present you with this commendation for exceptional service." The Queen stepped forward and handed George an official certificate, beautifully crafted on royal stationery and bearing the official seals of the monarchy. As George presented it to James, photographers captured the moment for the official palace records. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is the greatest honor of my life." But George wasn't finished. "Mr. Richardson, there is one more thing. My grandmother and I have discussed your exceptional service, and we would like to offer you a position with the Royal Protection Detail. This would mean additional training and responsibility, but also recognition of the leadership qualities you have demonstrated." The offer was completely unexpected. The Royal Protection Detail was an elite unit responsible for the personal security of senior members of the royal family. It was a position that many guards aspired to but few achieved, requiring additional training, higher security clearance, and demonstrated excellence in all aspects of service. James stood speechless for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered to him. His fellow guards looked on with pride and perhaps a touch of envy, understanding the significance of the opportunity being presented. "I would be honored to accept," James finally managed to say. "Thank you for this incredible opportunity." The ceremony concluded with applause from all present, but the real impact of what had happened extended far beyond the immediate moment. Word of James's promotion spread quickly through the palace staff, serving as inspiration for others, and reinforcing the message that exceptional service would be recognized and rewarded. In the days that followed, James began his transition to the Royal Protection Detail. The additional training was intense, covering everything from advanced security protocols to international diplomatic procedures. He would eventually be assigned to protect various members of the royal family during official engagements and state visits. For Prince George, the ceremony had been another important lesson in leadership. He had learned that recognition and appreciation were not just nice gestures, but essential tools for inspiring excellence and building loyalty. He had also discovered that he possessed a natural ability to identify quality in others and to take action to reward it appropriately. The Queen, observing her great-grandson's growing maturity and wisdom, felt increasingly confident about the future of the monarchy. George's instincts for leadership, his genuine care for others, and his understanding of the responsibilities that came with his position all indicated that he would someday be an exceptional king. As autumn turned to winter, the story of Prince George's recognition of James Richardson became part of Windsor Castle's rich tradition of memorable moments. It was shared with new staff members as an example of the royal family's appreciation for dedicated service, and it served as inspiration for guards and household staff throughout the royal properties. James Richardson, now part of the Royal Protection Detail, continued to excel in his expanded role. His dedication to duty remained unwavering, but it was now enhanced by a deep personal connection to the royal family he served. He had experienced firsthand their capacity for recognition and gratitude, and it motivated him to give his very best every single day. The letter that Prince George had written to him remained framed on his desk, but it was now accompanied by the official commendation from the ceremony and a photograph of the presentation moment. These items served as daily reminders of the honor he had received and the responsibility he now carried. During quiet moments in the guardhouse, James would sometimes reflect on the chain of events that had led from that simple moment of wanting to help an elderly visitor to receiving recognition from Prince George himself. It reminded him that every action, no matter how small, had the potential to make a difference, and that dedication to duty was always worth maintaining. For the other members of the palace staff, James's story became a source of inspiration and hope. It demonstrated that their work was noticed, that excellence would be rewarded, and that the royal family genuinely cared about the people who served them. This knowledge made their own service more meaningful and encouraged them to maintain the highest standards in their work. The incident also had a broader impact on the royal household's culture. Other members of the royal family began taking more notice of the staff members who served them, making efforts to learn names, acknowledge good work, and show appreciation for dedication. The example set by Prince George had ripple effects that improved the working environment throughout the royal properties. As the first anniversary of their initial meeting approached, both Prince George and James Richardson had been changed by their encounter. For George, it had been a formative lesson in leadership, empathy, and the importance of recognizing service. For James, it had been a life-changing experience that had elevated his career and filled him with pride and purpose. The simple gesture of respect that had started it all, a young prince bowing his head to thank a dedicated guard, had grown into something much larger. It had become a symbol of the kind of leadership that values service, recognizes excellence, and treats all people with dignity and respect. And in the grand traditions of Windsor Castle, where centuries of history were preserved and celebrated, the story of Prince George and Guard Richardson took its place among the memorable moments that defined the character of the monarchy and the people who served it with pride and dedication. The gesture had indeed silenced everyone who witnessed it, not because it was grand or elaborate, but because it was genuine, heartfelt, and perfectly timed. It demonstrated that the most powerful acts of leadership often come not from commanding authority, but from showing authentic appreciation for those who serve with honor and dedication.